Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're looking at suicide. A sensitive topic, but one that's, so important to talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
So we've got some pretty intense source material for this one. We've got a website that's all about, its focus on breaking destructive cycles. And then we've got a personal letter that grapples with a lot of questions around suicide. The website especially is fascinating. It explores some potential spiritual consequences of suicide.
Okay.
And it even shares personal anecdotes from someone who claims to have actually experienced suicide firsthand.
Yeah, it's important for us to approach this topic with respect and understanding. This website is offering one perspective, not necessarily a universal truth
Right.
about suicide or anything.
Right, totally. So
Yeah.
the website uses some pretty strong language,
Yeah.
calling suicide the most self-centered, selfish act, and even brings up this idea,
Yeah.
like ancestral curses that impact generations after a suicide.
Right.
It's pretty intense stuff.
Yeah. It's definitely intense. But it's fascinating how they link suicide to not just to individual choices, but to a broader lack of connection in society.
Okay.
They talk about people feeling consumed by an idea or an illusion, feeling trapped, and ultimately just profoundly disconnected from love. It's almost like they're suggesting that suicide is a symptom of something larger.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. So it's not just about the individual, but about the environment they're in.
Exactly. And this whole concept of like these ancestral curses, it's also worth exploring a little deeper.
Oh, for sure.
It suggests that the consequences of suicide ripple outwards, impacting not just the individual, but potentially future generations as well. It's an idea that's present in a lot of different cultures and belief systems, so it definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole discussion.
Okay, so we've got this website talking about pretty heavy spiritual consequences. And then we have this letter,
Yep.
which takes a totally different stance. The writer is all about individual sovereignty. They believe that people have the right to choose freedom from suffering, even if that means choosing suicide. They even question why suicide is seen as so negative, compared to other harmful choices that we make every single day.
Yeah, it brings up this classic philosophical debate
Yeah.
about personal autonomy versus these larger spiritual or ethical frameworks.
Right.
It really challenges us to think about, does the individual have ultimate control over their life and death? Or are there consequences that extend beyond our understanding? It's a really big question.
It is. And then the letter writer, they compare suicide to the slow self-destruction that we often see with unhealthy habits.
Right.
Like, why is one considered tragic and the other is just seen as, part of life?
I know. It forces us to consider different forms of self-harm and how we as a society perceive them.
Totally.
Where are the lines between self-destructive behavior, unhealthy coping mechanisms, and what this letter writer is viewing as a deliberate choice for freedom from suffering?
So on the one hand, we've got the website saying suicide has major spiritual consequences, potentially even affecting your ancestors.
Yeah.
And then we have this letter arguing for individual choice and questioning societal norms around suffering and self-harm. It's almost like they're speaking different languages.
It really is like they're operating within completely different frameworks, and that's where the website author's personal story adds a whole other layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Okay.
They claim to have actually died by suicide, experienced this horrifying void, completely devoid of love, and then somehow returned. They call it having mastered suicide, which is...
Yeah, mastered suicide. I mean, that's a really loaded phrase.
It is.
What does it even mean to master death?
Exactly right. That's where things get really tricky. It raises questions about the nature of subjective experience and the validity of claiming authority on something as unknown and final as death.
Right.
Is the author speaking from a place of genuine insight? Or is this a reflection of trauma and the struggle to make sense of an incredibly difficult experience?
Yeah, we can't just take that claim at face value. We have to consider the emotional and psychological factors that might be shaping the author's perspective.
Absolutely. And while the author's experience is undoubtedly powerful and thought-provoking, we need to be careful about sensationalizing it. We need to approach these kinds of claims with sensitivity and a critical eye, recognizing that they come from a place of deep personal pain and might not represent a universal experience.
Right, so the website author is speaking from this very personal, intense place, claiming to have seen the other side and come back with this knowledge about consequences of suicide.
Exactly. And this leads to some pretty interesting contradictions.
Oh, how so?
Well, on the one hand, The author emphasizes the choice aspect of suicide. They even use the phrase, my body, my choice. But on the other hand, they highlight the really profound and lasting impact that suicide has on the people who are left behind.
So they're acknowledging that even though it's a choice, it's not a choice made in a vacuum. There are consequences that reach beyond the individual.
Exactly. And this brings us to a story the author shares about Molokai.
Yes, the Molokai story. This is where things get really interesting. This is where the author's personal struggles connect to a broader mission.
Right.
You talk about freeing darkness from specific locations, like Kalaupapa and Williamsburg. This part almost felt mystical, like we stepped into a different genre of story.
It definitely has that mystical element to it. What's really intriguing is that Kalaupapa has a very specific and very tragic history.
Right.
It was a leper colony where people were exiled and forced to live in isolation. So the author's mission to free darkness from this place, coupled with their own struggles with cancer, a plane crash, betrayal by friends, it paints this picture of immense suffering and a search for meaning in the face of it all.
So the author isn't just grappling with the suicide question on a theoretical level.
Yeah.
They're dealing with it through these really real, really intense personal experiences.
Exactly. And this personal struggle is contrasted with a choice to succumb to despair.
Right.
Or find a higher purpose. The author ultimately chooses to stay in Molokai, despite the hardships, because of a commitment to helping other people. It's a really powerful example of how you can find meaning, even in the darkest of circumstances.
It's almost like the author's personal journey becomes a metaphor for the whole suicide question. Do we choose despair and isolation? Or do we find a way to connect with something bigger than ourselves, even when we're surrounded by suffering?
That's a really great point. It highlights how complex the human experience is. We're always grappling with these choices, these internal battles between darkness and light, despair and hope. And the Molokai story becomes kind of a microcosm of that struggle, a way for the author to explore these themes through their own life and their own experiences.
Okay, so we've got the website author claiming to have mastered suicide and returning with all this knowledge about spiritual consequences.
Yeah.
And then we've got the letter writer who believes in individual choice and questions the negativity surrounding suicide. Two totally different viewpoints.
It's like they're having two separate conversations, and that's what makes it so interesting, because both perspectives, despite their differences, point to the same underlying question. What is the nature of suffering? And how do we, as individuals and as a society, make sense of it?
That's such a profound way to frame it. It's not just about suicide,
No.
but about the larger human experience of pain and choice and the search for meaning.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of my body, my choice comes in.
Oh, okay.
Both the website author and the letter writer actually use this phrase, but in very different contexts.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really interesting observation. It's like they're using the same language, but talking about completely different things.
Yeah, exactly. The letter writer uses it to assert their right to end their suffering through suicide, while the website author seems to be grappling with the broader implications of individual choice in general.
So it's about recognizing that. Even though you might have the freedom to make certain choices,
Yeah.
those choices have consequences that extend beyond just yourself.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of everything.
Yeah.
How our choices impact not just us, but the people around us and even society as a whole.
This makes me think about how the website author describes suicide as a choice made, minus divine love and Father's blessing. That phrase really stuck with me. It's like they're implying that.
Yeah.
Even in something as personal and difficult as suicide, there might be a right way and a wrong way to do it.
That's a really interesting take.
Yeah.
It suggests that even within the framework of individual choice, there might be these spiritual or ethical dimensions that influence the outcome.
It's almost like they're suggesting that if you approach suicide with a sense of connection to something larger, something loving and supportive,
Yeah.
the experience might be different than if you approach it from a place of isolation and despair.
That's a really profound thought.
Yeah.
It really challenges us to consider the motivations and intentions behind all of our choices, even in the most extreme circumstances. Are we acting out of love, compassion, connection, or are we acting from a place of fear and pain and disconnection?
I mean, the website author's description of the void that they experienced after dying by suicide is pretty chilling.
It was intense.
It really makes you wonder about, the nature of consciousness and What actually happens after we die?
It's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
It's a question that has haunted humanity for centuries, and while we may never have any definitive answers, I think exploring these types of experiences, these claims of crossing over and returning, it can really help us grapple with the mysteries of life and death in a more meaningful way.
Totally. It also makes you think about the possibility of, like, communication with the dead.
Oh, yeah.
The website author talks about mediating between a woman who is considering suicide and her deceased friend named John. Do you think it's actually possible to connect with people who have passed on?
You know, it's a really complex question.
Yeah.
And it's something that's been debated for a long time. There's really no scientific evidence to prove or disprove communication with the dead.
Right.
But it's a concept that resonates really deeply with so many different cultures and belief systems. So I think ultimately, it often comes down to personal faith and interpretation.
And it's interesting how the author frames their role in that interaction. Like, they claim to have mastered suicide, and therefore they have this special authority to speak to this woman's deceased friend.
Yeah, it's a bold claim for sure. And it definitely raises questions about the nature of their experience and the validity of their insights. Are they suggesting that dying by suicide grants you some special kind of knowledge or access to the afterlife or something?
And even with this claimed mastery, it's worth pointing out that the author doesn't actually try to talk the woman out of suicide.
Huh, interesting.
They acknowledge it as a choice and emphasize that they're just sharing their own experience and perspective.
So it's not about imposing their beliefs on other people, but rather just offering a different lens through which to view this complex and personal issue.
It's a good reminder that there are a lot of different ways to think about suicide, and that it's so important to be respectful of those different perspectives, even when they might challenge your own beliefs.
Absolutely. I think creating a space where open and honest dialogue about suicide can occur without judgment or condemnation is so crucial. It's only then that we can begin to understand the complexity of this issue and work towards more effective prevention and intervention strategies.
The author's experience in Molokai, the place where they felt drawn to and really seemed to find a new purpose, is so moving. They talk about freeing darkness from specific locations, like Kalopapa and Williamsburg. What do you think they mean by that?
Well, it's a little bit enigmatic, but it seems to suggest that they believe in the possibility of transforming negative energy or removing spiritual darkness from certain places. It's an idea that's present in a lot of different spiritual traditions, this idea of cleansing or purifying a space.
And their decision to stay in Molokai, even after all of the hardship they went through, the cancer, the plane crash, the betrayal, it really speaks volumes about their commitment to this mission of helping others.
It does. It highlights the transformative power of finding a purpose greater than yourself, a reason to keep going even when things feel really challenging. It's a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
Yeah. Something the author said that really resonated with me was about feeling overkill and useless at the same time. I think that's something a lot of people can relate to.
Oh, absolutely. It speaks to that feeling of being both too much and not enough, a sense of inadequacy or unworthiness. That can be incredibly debilitating. It's that feeling of being stuck, of not belonging, not knowing where you fit in.
And yet, despite feeling all of that, the author chooses to stay and focus on helping other people.
Yeah, and it suggests that even when we're feeling lost and uncertain, we can still find a sense of purpose and fulfillment in reaching out and connecting with others. It's in those moments of connection, of giving and receiving support, that we often find a path forward.
The way that the author describes their friend's suicide is a really stark reminder of the devastating impact that suicide can have on the people who are left behind.
It's a heartbreaking story, and it really highlights the importance of seeking help and support. When you're struggling with suicidal thoughts, there are people who care and want to help, and there are resources available. Reaching out can be the first step towards finding hope and healing.
And their comment about speaking to the friend's daughters as they wipe the brains off the wall is so powerful and disturbing. It really drives home the visceral reality of suicide and the lasting trauma that it can inflict.
It's a stark reminder that suicide is not just an individual act. It's one that has these ripple effects, impacting families and friends and entire communities. It's a tragedy that leaves scars that can take generations to heal.
It's a reminder that we need to approach this topic with a lot of sensitivity and compassion, recognizing the pain and complexity that surrounds it.
Absolutely.
It's not about finding simple answers or easy solutions, but about understanding and empathy and a willingness to support those who are struggling.
I think that's the key. Creating a space where people feel safe to share their struggles and seek help without feel of judgment or shame.
Yeah?
Building a culture of support and understanding is essential to preventing suicide and helping those who have been affected by it.
The author's statement about free will, being able to do good and evil,
Yeah.
and how we can choose to believe that good and evil does not really exist, is a really interesting thought.
It really is. It speaks to the fundamental questions about morality and the choices that we make in life.
Right.
Are we inherently good or evil? Do those concepts even exist? Or are they constructs that we create to try and make sense of the world around us?
Yeah, it's a good reminder that there aren't always easy answers
Yeah.
when it comes to these big existential questions. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's about wrestling with those questions, exploring different perspectives,
Yeah.
and ultimately finding our own way.
Right. And I think it challenges us to examine our own beliefs and values, to really consider the complexities of human nature, and to approach these issues with an open mind and a compassionate heart.
Their final comment about living in a world where, at least for here, it does exist, is a little ambiguous. What do you think they're getting at?
It's definitely open to interpretation, but it seems like they're suggesting that while the concepts of good and evil might be subjective or even illusory, they still have a very real and tangible impact on our lives in this world. Even if we choose to believe that good and evil don't exist, we still have to deal with the consequences of our actions and the choices that we make.
So it's like they're saying
Yeah.
that we can't escape the reality of duality, this interplay of light and darkness, joy and suffering. That kind of defines the human experience.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we live in a world of duality, where our choices have consequences, and where we're constantly navigating the complexities of right and wrong. And maybe that's where the real meaning is. Embracing the messy and complicated and beautiful tapestry of life, with all of its contradictions and uncertainties.
I mean, the author's story is full of contradictions.
It is.
And it definitely raises more questions than it answers.
Sure.
But I think that's what makes it so fascinating and thought-provoking.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that life is full of contradictions. And there aren't always easy answers when it comes to these really big questions.
It's a story that stays with you long after you finish reading it,
Yeah.
and really challenges you to think deeply about suffering and choice and what it all means.
It's a story that invites us to have a deeper conversation about these really important issues, a conversation that can help us better understand ourselves and the world around us.
It's interesting how both the website and the letter both talk about connection. Yeah, even though they're coming from such different perspectives.
That's a great point. You know, the website author finds a sense of purpose. By connecting to a higher power and dedicating their life to helping others. And then you have the letter writer, who seems to be searching for a different kind of connection, one that really acknowledges their individual suffering and their right to choose.
So maybe it's not just about whether or not connection is there, but the kind of connection that's missing.
Exactly. And this gets to the heart of the issue, right?
Yeah.
If we're looking at suicide as a symptom of disconnection, then the solution can't just be telling people to stay alive.
Right.
It has to be about addressing those really deep feelings of isolation, of not being seen or heard, of feeling like you're a burden to others.
It makes you think about how we approach mental health and suffering as a society.
Yeah.
Are we creating spaces where people actually feel safe to talk about these things, to reach out for help without being judged?
That's the question, isn't it? We can talk all day about individual choice and spiritual consequences, but at the end of the day, we need to create a culture that supports mental well-being and recognizes that human experience is complicated.
I think about the website author's story, about choosing to stay in Molokai and help others, even while going through so much pain.
Yeah.
It's like finding meaning and purpose can really be a lifeline, a reason to keep going when things are so difficult.
Absolutely. It reminds us that even in those really dark moments, there's always potential for transformation. We find strength and resilience we didn't even know we had.
Yeah.
And often, that comes from connecting with something bigger than ourselves, whether it's a community, a cause, a sense of spirituality.
And it also makes you think about the stories we tell ourselves about suffering.
Yeah, that's interesting.
The website author talks about their experiences this journey towards mastering suicide and fighting darkness. And then the letter writer focuses on individual sovereignty and seeking freedom from pain.
It shows how much our narratives shape how we understand these issues, how we frame our experiences, the language we use, our beliefs. It all influences how we approach suicide, both as individuals and as a society.
This deep dive has been quite the journey. We've gone from spiritual claims to philosophical arguments, from near-death experiences to reflections on suffering and connection. It's obvious there's no simple answer when it comes to suicide.
Absolutely not. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways here. This isn't a topic that can be boiled down to easy solutions or black and white thinking.
Right.
It requires nuance and empathy and a willingness to see things from different perspectives, even when those perspectives challenge what we believe.
What stands out to you most from all of this? What will you be thinking about after we finish this deep dive?
For me, it's the reminder that we are all connected. Even in our suffering, our choices, our stories, the way we approach life and death, they all have an impact, not just on us, but on the world around us. And I think recognizing that interconnectedness, that shared humanity, is the first step towards creating a world where suicide isn't seen as the answer, but as a call for understanding and compassion.
That's beautifully said. And for everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you some new things to think about. As we've explored, suicide is a complex issue that touches on some of the most fundamental parts of being human: choice, suffering, meaning, connection. Maybe this conversation has made you think differently about these things. What resonated most with you? What will you take away from this? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, you are not alone.